Sorry, Andrew, did I? No? No, Yanni, it was, sorry.
I mean, I kind of had concerns because I do think you need, one of the lessons from the old plan is that B3B and the buffer zones weren't actually adequate at all. So you get a lot of activity happening right up against people's fences. 20 metres doesn't sound like very much. Doesn't sound like very much when you're talking about big, huge buildings going up. I do wonder if you're trying to get some of those cycling and pedestrian and greenfield amenity, that 50 metres seems pretty reasonable. Otherwise, I don't see how you get it. So, and I'm concerned that also that we went out with 50 and now we're coming back from it.
The risk, the difficulty we've got is that we're talking about sizable areas of land. Whilst these greenfield areas are large, there's a need to provide for the use of that land, and a 50-metre deep buffer is significant in my mind. And you look at existing industrial areas and the setbacks in the proposed plan of 6 metres between buildings and other zones, and we can achieve adequate protection of those properties through a range of rules, not just setbacks. And to have a 50-metre setback is, in my mind, crude because it doesn't necessarily address the issues. It's more than just visual effects, and you can control noise through standards in the plan, maximum noise limits.
I appreciate what you're saying. What we know, unfortunately, is that the monitoring of conditions of consents, enforcement of things that were supposed to be done, and follow-up of things like odour, air pollution. In reality, it's not a very effective method. So, you know, if you look in Phillipstown, if you look in Wolfston, if you look in, what you see is this kind of constant cycle of complaints. And it just seems to me, if we can't learn from that and say actually having a adequate buffer actually reduces the opportunity for those issues to arise, I would feel more comfortable. And I think, I mean, what's the total land mass in this area?
The total land area of this industrial area is 170 hectares, but...
So out of the 170, if you had a 50-metre buffer, how much would that take up?
I don't have the measurements of the distance, but that it's not just about this circumstance. The risk is that we have to manage apply a consistent approach across greenfield areas. And for instance, in North Belfast, we've consulted with the community and got feedback that some feedback that 15 metres is acceptable from their perspective. The Commodore Hotel, for instance, sought a 20-metre setback, and to impose a 50-metre setback creates a risk of other people having the expectation that wherever there's industry, there's going to be a 50-metre setback, and on smaller sites that will create issues. And
this is a big industrial place.
But it's not all in the same ownership, and so effectively one land in the southwest area there's multiple landowners, whereas the north side of the block there's one landowner, and so 15 metres might be the entire depth of someone's property that they want to develop for industry, but they can't because of the setback. So we need to manage the impacts it has.
And the issues, as you've explained them, Councillor, are ones of enforcement and monitoring. But if that's the case, then that's where the issues need to be resolved. That's not a reason to unnecessarily put in a buffer that's 50 metres wide. Well, especially when the issues that we're discussing, like the amenity issues, noise, any kind of obnoxious dust or what have you, can be dealt with through other rules.
They don't get dealt with, which is the problem.
Yes, but that is the problem. But that's not a district plan problem. That is a monitoring and enforcement issue that then we as an organisation need to look at. Actually,
it's a zone. Part of it is a zoning issue.
Well,
so inadequate buffer has led to issues. I mean, I don't know how others feel, but you know, I guess there's concerns here around things like stormwater. The cycleways, what I can't understand is if you've got a new development, why wouldn't you put the cycleway through that development rather than us go through and put it on the road when we had land that was being rezoned? Why not just add that land in at the same time?
On the cycleway, that's some planning that's been done anyway by our asset network planning team.
I know, but it seems to me that the better opportunity, the more sensible thing is, rather than us go through a huge process to acquire land, to spend a lot of money, is actually when people get the huge financial gain from getting the rezoning, that they actually put back some of the infrastructure that we think a modern city should have, which is cycleways, adequate stormwater, etc., etc.
I can liaise with colleagues about that cycle route and address that issue, but just going back to the setback, there's a range of rules that address the effects of industry close to residential. There's recession planes, which are intended to limit shading of properties. There's landscaping, which is to address the visual impacts of...
Yeah, I know.
And the challenge, the difficulty is with setbacks is that they tend to be potentially forgotten spaces behind buildings, and you run the risk of that setback becoming almost a lesser quality than what would otherwise take place, because we can't impose a landscaping requirement across that entire 50-metre setback, which comes at a there's a significant cost with that, but it's also inefficient. And so
The point, though, is that there are some existing residents there, aren't there?
the 50-metre setback that was put forward was only for one property, which is
Right.
within the industrial zone. So
Right.
the
So
setback...
there's a residence, there's a house within this,
Yeah.
and obviously they feel not pleased about the fact that this is all becoming industrial. Is there any other way of mitigating the impact on them short of a 50-metre setback?
We can have a reduced setback, but have potentially denser landscaping required to retain that
Yeah,
visual
that would
buffer.
be cool. If you could plant about 50 or 60 fruit trees, that would be excellent.
I guess the issue too is that, and I have no idea what the future use will be of that site, but if this person, for instance, chose to sell on the basis of it being his own business industrial, then you would end up with a 50-metre setback for no reason at all.
It was proposed by the landowner, and was, to be honest, the draft that went out, it was an error. It was intended to be reduced in the consultation version that we put out for public feedback.
Was it 50 metres?
Just touching on the Woolston industrial area, map 6. Can I just confirm who hasn't got a map? Set of maps? I can. Just briefly, there's been feedback about the future boundaries of industrial zones in Woolston, and on this map there's marked the Tannery, Gelita, Skellerup sites, and we're proposing to shift the boundary between the general and the heavy industrial zone, so effectively increasing the size of the industrial general zone to include the Skellerup site, which has previously been heavy industrial. By rezoning it as an industrial general zone, it does provide greater scope for trade suppliers and yard-based retailing and other uses that aren't provided for in the heavy industrial zone, and that provides greater flexibility to ensure reuse of that land, because otherwise there's the risk that it remains vacant and derelict. So we're providing greater flexibility in parts of Woolston, but still protecting the industry that does remain there by retaining a heavy industrial zone.
Looking at doing in Woolston, and how they wanted to change the entire area around to reflect the history of that area, which I thought was stunning. Is that going to be allowed in this? Because if somebody's got all the energy in the world and the desire to transform the area around the tannery, I would love them to do that.
There's provision made in the chapter to consider where a site's unsuitable for industry in the future, set of criteria to consider the appropriateness of mixed use or residential, where a site's not going to lead to reverse sensitivity effects on existing or future industry in the area. So we can consider on a case-by-case basis suitable brownfield sites, but also in the second phase we're going about identifying suitable brownfield sites for mixed use or residential. But in this phase we're proposing to retain areas for industry to recognise that there is still a lot of existing industry in those locations and we need to enable them to continue.
Showed us what he wanted to have happen around the tannery. I thought it was stunning, and I think most other people did too. And it made what wasn't one of the most desirable areas of Christchurch at the moment into arguably one of the most interesting. I would love for that to be able to happen if somebody's got the energy and drive to be able to do that. I don't want the council standing in the way. So what I want to know is when he comes back for stage 2 of the tannery continued, can he do that?
I haven't seen their proposals for around the tannery, but
Can I add, Madam Chair, though, that this is an industrial area and the proposed plan is proposing to maintain it as an industrial area, albeit change where heavy industry can go versus general industry. There are a lot of existing factories, manufacturing units there. There are a lot of people who work in those areas, and I don't think it's appropriate to simply change the zoning on the basis what the tannery wants to do. What Mark has said is there are rules that allow us to look at a site-by-site proposal on the basis of what they're proposing in amongst that industrial zoning. But at the moment, what the proposed plan is doing is maintaining the area as it is.
I do want to enable the tannery to do what they want to do. So that's why I'm being pedantic about this. Andrew?
And just to add to that, certainly the comments that Mark made around sensitivities, and in particular reverse sensitivities, when we consider the proximity of, for example, Gelita to that site, it sounds as though the plan that Vicky just described maybe wouldn't find it as easy to go through that process as we might hope because of the reverse sensitivities, particularly around that heavy industrial use.
Putting aside Gelita, who have non-compliances with their consents, there is a wider view from industry other than Gelita, and that's represented by the New Zealand Manufacturers and Exporters Association, who represent this industry, that the area should be protected for those industrial companies that still operate in the area. So it's a real issue, putting aside Gelita for a moment, that those industries are concerned about.
It would be useful for us also to see what the tannery are considering for stage 2. We haven't been shown.
How would it be if those guys come and see you and actually explain what they want to do, because you're probably going to love it, and look at, before we adopt this part, whether it's possible to actually put a little bit around their area so that they can do it. They appreciate that they're an industrial zone, but it is a very different concept that I think people in Christchurch would love, and I don't want us through our district plan to prohibit it.
Well, very happy to meet with them. We need to know what it is they're proposing because they haven't been to speak to us, so that would be useful. Yeah, we would need to look at what it is they're proposing and how the rules currently either work for or against that.
Okay, I would like us to do that before we adopt that component,
Sure.
If that's possible. Sorry, Yanni, then Pauline.
So, but there's a lot of uncertainty in Wolston at the moment. You've got independent fisheries with their issues. You've got the Skillet site that's been vacated. You've got the tannery, and you've got some of the other industry. You've also got a lot of mixed-use residential in here as well, which I'd just be really interested in understanding what IG or IH provides in terms of residential. Does it allow it? To what level? How have you looked at what's happened over the time in this area to influence the zoning that you've put in place?
The residential that's gone into parts of Wolston has been I understand the proposals have been for live-work units, so there's a work component to those units downstairs, generally speaking, with the residential above. And the rules at the moment allow for custodial or residential associated with custodial or security purposes, and that's been utilised to the extent that proposals that have come forward and been developed for those live-work units. We're proposing that any future residential development in industrial zones is assessed on a case-by-case basis as a discretionary activity. There are some brownfield sites that are no longer appropriate for industry, which we'll consider on their merits for residential or mixed use, but we don't want to run the risk of permitting residential in industrial zones if it's going to potentially erode the environment around or cause issues with the uses around it. So, for instance, there's abrasive blasting businesses in Woolston, and if we were to permit residential, there's a risk of residential going next to this business, complaining about the business, and the business has to move, or if it's a small business, consider whether they can continue. So,
what I wanted from the start, and I don't know if we can do this, but I'd love us to do, we need to do some kind of planning exercise in Woolston, because there's just a myriad of issues, a myriad of uncertainty, and actually getting people together and talking through and actually getting a sense of what is different post-earthquake, what is different, 100 years on in the world that we live in terms of environmental outcomes, in terms of the cycleway access. There's a number of issues in here that, I just don't think a blunt, it's industrial H or industrial G, or really kind of captures it.
Yeah, there is, and this has been raised before also by the Mayor, the need for what we might call, I don't really like using master planning, but a urban renewal type exercise happening over this area. But this also needs to be weighed up with the issue that was raised previously about having all industry moving out to the west. And there are people who work in this area, in these factories and businesses that are located in the east. So, there are all sorts of issues here about weighing up where you should have industrial, how far you want people to travel to get to their workplace, versus simply taking away the industrial and perhaps allowing it all to be developed, and not just by the tannery, but by other organisations. So there is a bigger planning issue to be done here. However, it can't be done within the time frame that I understand that we have yet to finish this district plan review, and it's a more detailed, as you describe, a far more detailed, intricate planning exercise that needs to be done, which is outside of the district plan review as such at the moment anyway. I can't see that can be done without other things falling off the radar.
From now and what happens as a result, can I suggest that, are you okay if you meet with the Castles?
Yes, we will do our best to meet with them. Yes, if they're available, yes.
And come back to us on the tannery component at least. It's actually not about putting residential or anything in there. It's, bless you, it's just about how bridges and maybe tourism and things would work in a heavy industrial area.
Certainly, we're happy to make the time. We'll make contact with them later today.
Could I just add that my understanding was that it was particularly in relation to that area around where the tannery is now in the river, what they were really asking for too was enforcement of for example, the pollution issues for Gelita and things like that. Yeah. They weren't asking for a big change in the whole industry across the area. And I guess we have noted that part of it though, like Skellerup, is currently empty.
That's right, and the Gelita enforcement issues lie with ECAN.
Thank you. Following on from Yanni and Phil, I think it's got such a lot of special features in here, and one of it's the historical nature, which we would like to see protected, and the other one is the river. Mm-hmm. And looking at the map, I just want you to explain, is there any setbacks from the river for landowners, or do landowners own right up to the river? And whose responsibility is the river, and how much can people perhaps like the Cassells do?
That's a good question, and that is coming through to you in the second phase of the chapters. We will be looking at that. I believe there is some setback now in the operative plan, and I'm sure that will continue.
There's historically there potentially is buildings close or right up to the river, but there's provisions in the subdivision chapter which
Could be.
possibly deal with esplanade reserves,
Which is coming
strips.
to you shortly.
So that might give us a tool to protect.
It might, if it's in the subdivision chapter now. The subdivision chapter is split into two phases, unfortunately, because of the two phases of various chapter types that we have going through. So, yeah, sorry.
Can I just say too that some of us, and we're not necessarily royalists, would like perhaps the Queen's chain to be brought back into this area.
That's right, that's what I was sort of getting to, and part of the Cassells' vision was using the river and maybe reinstating these boat rides back down to the estuary, and we wouldn't want to, we'd like to facilitate that. And so there is private ownership, of course, but it's industrial ownership, I think, where I'm coming from at the moment.
We need to meet with them to understand what the proposal is. They haven't been to see us.
It should be a carte blanche rule around all our rivers, because they're all our treasures, you know, and we want to protect them.
I agree, and that would be done
by them
with...
and use them as an asset, yeah.